Shishi imo hoko tawu umitibot sawi YouTuber olo hotedushe. Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my YouTube channel where today I am again talking a little bit about my ongoing project of writing a fantasy game book. Now, the last few episodes I have talked quite a bit extensively about world building and how important it is and why it makes sense to do deliberate world building from the get-go. And one of the aspects of that is language, because if you want to give names to people, places, things, geographical features, mountains, deities, etc., it makes sense to have a language that makes all these choices coherent. In most fantasy fiction, people don't bother making up their own language. Instead, they make something that sounds a little bit like Tolkien's languages, or they just steal some names and words from somewhere else. They just make up something that sounds a bit like it's from fantasy fiction. Um, and the problem with that is, of course, that you end up with something that is a bit of an incoherent mess, and it doesn't necessarily matter, but it does feel quite satisfying, I think, to make everything tie together in quite subtle ways. And I agree with Tolkien on this. The language comes first, the story comes after, because very often the story is also informed by the language, which is the case with The Lord of the Rings. It started as a linguistic exercise, and the story came from the language, not the other way around. And so I've been quite adamant early on that I want to have my own language for my fantasy gamebook project. And I've also mentioned before that I have been working on one a few years ago. I started work on one that I called Worldbuilding, which is based on Norwegian and Old Norse. Now, there are a few problems with that language. That means I shouldn't be using it, and I'm gonna tell you about that now. So I was meaning to adapt that language for this project, but I remember now why I stopped working on it. It has a few issues. So when you start making your own Conlang, your constructed language, the first thing you do is to decide on your phonetic inventory. So which vowels do you have? Which consonants do you have? That's the first thing. And Borvagefti, fine, it has a similar phonetic inventory to Old Norse, not too complicated. And then you create a list of, you define what a syllable can look like. So you have a syllable consists of usually of a vowel plus a consonant cluster, or a consonant cluster plus a vowel plus a consonant cluster. So those are the three basic ways that a syllable can look. In some languages, you only have consonant cluster vowel. That's it, or just consonant vowel. So in Borvagefti, of course, based on Old Norse and Norwegian, I wanted a very similar syllable structure to Old Norse and Norwegian. So I started defining what sounds can start a syllable, which ones can end it. And these are different sounds, by the way. Just like in English, you don't use all possible consonants or combinations of consonants in the beginning of a syllable as you do at the end. It's a different list, and usually the list for the beginning is shorter than the list for the end. For instance, the word sips, third person, sips, starts with an S, you have a vowel, E, and then you have ps at the end. You can't start a syllable in English with ps. It's just not possible. It isn't part of the phonetic structure of English. This is why loanwords from Greek that start with PS, like psychology, aren't pronounced psychology in English, because you just don't do that in English. So when you make your conlang, you define what is the beginning, the onset of a syllable, and then you have the vowel, and then you have the end of a syllable, which is known as a coda. And when I did this for VulgarLang, I came up with this list of possible syllables. This is, oops, that's a little bit too much there. This is printed 2 pages back and front. It is, I think, more than 10,000 possible syllables. Just to read a little bit random here. So we have on PJ here. Pied, pied, piedl, pief, piefs, piefs, pieft, pieg, pieged, piegl, etc. Yeah. It was quite a lot. So that's in itself not a problem. The problem with that is quite related to these syllables, because if you make a language that is similar to your own, or one you know, and you have a similar phonetic inventory, and you have a similar syllable structure, what you end up with is a long list of possible words. No, that's not the right way to phrase it. That means that all the words in the language you base it on are possible words in your Conlang. And a lot of the words that don't exist in your own language that you base it on, you might make in your Conlang, will feel like they mean a certain thing because they're similar to words in your language. And this is something that is really, really hard to tear yourself away from, because if I want to come up with a word for fish in VulgarLang, for instance, my mind will immediately gravitate towards something similar to fisk. Which is terrible, because I want it to be different. I don't want it to look like it's a language related to Norwegian. I don't want it to be related to Old Norse or Norwegian. And which means that not only do I gravitate towards making the same meanings of words as in Norwegian or English, or Norwegian or Old Norse, sorry. If I deliberately try to not make it like Old Norse and Norwegian, I'll sort of have to do that actively as well. And if I make a nice word, it might give me connotations to existing words. It is just a nightmare to do. And it's so hard to tear yourself away from the ties with the inspiration for the language in pronouns, in word endings, in verb endings, in vocabulary. It is actually a terrible idea to base a Conlang, or certainly your first one, on a language you already know. What you really need is to tear yourself so much away from what you know that those connections are broken, and you can actually make words and endings and language features that are natural. So my advice to you for your first Conlang, make it something totally different to your own language. So I'm going to shelf the VulgarLang for now. I might use the writing system, by the way, for my new Conlang, but as a project that will have to be put on ice for a long time. Now, I also had ideas for quite complex grammar in VulgarLang, because I wanted it to have a case system, just like in Old Norse or Old English. And for those who don't know what the case system is, it is a language. A language has a case system if grammatical function, so the function in a sentence, is decided by morphology. That is to say that a word is changed, for instance, by adding an ending to it or changing a vowel, to indicate what function that word has in that language. No, in that sentence, sorry. And then you have that contrasted with a syntax-based grammar, like in English, where the function of a word is linked with the position of the word in the sentence. So, for instance, the man gave the dog a bone is a nice English sentence. And we know exactly what those different elements of the sentence mean because they have a very specific word order. So we know that the man is the one who does the action. The man gives is the action. The dog is the recipient of the action, and the bone is what is acted upon. So that is the subject, verb, indirect object, and direct object of the sentence. If you want to move that around because you want to emphasize part of that sentence differently, then you have to do things in English by adding words, adverbs, prepositions. You have to add subordinate clauses, etc. You have to do lots of additions and changes in order to make that happen. So you could say the dog is who got the bone from the man. The bone is what the man gave the dog, etc. So you can move things around even though English has a strict syntax, it also has a very flexible syntax in that you can move things around for emphasis to change the meaning of a sentence. If you have a case-based system where each of these words have a specific ending, so for instance, you could imagine that man didn't have an ending because it is the main, a subject is usually the main case. So say that is just man. So man gave. Dog being an indirect object is what would be known as a dative case, usually in certainly in 4-case languages. So let's just say that we just add at the end, so dogum. And let's just say that the bone, which is what is being given, the direct object, gets an a at the end. And of course, the bone would be an accusative case. So man gave dogum bona means the same thing. But if you want to move that around in a different order for emphasis, you don't need to add anything because you have a case system. So you could say bona man gave dogum. You could say dogum man bona gave. It all means the same thing because that's how a case-based system works. Now, of course, some case-based systems, they also have a specific syntax, word order, and they might also have more than one marker on a word indicating what it does. And this is what is known as grammatical redundancy. So it is quite common for actually a word order to be not strict, but sort of a standard word order that also exists in case-based languages. And then when you move things around, just like in English, you're changing the emphasis. So it isn't neutral anymore necessarily when you move bona, man, dogum, gave. When you move the bone to the front, the bone might be the focus of the sentence, just like in English. The bone is what the man gave the dog. So, and of course, I did want to make a case-based system for Worldbuilding, but that adds a lot of complexity as well. And also, I would have wanted to have probably a what is known in European languages as a gender system, but of course, which is more correctly referred to as noun categories. I'm not a big fan of this grammatical gender term because it implies something that isn't true, which is that certain things and objects which don't have biological gender are associated with biological gender, which they're not. Usually, in most cases, the reason that we have these so-called genders and some words are known as masculine and some as feminine, it has nothing to do with biological gender. It just so happens that originally the words associated with masculine and feminine have certain sonic qualities, certain combinations of sounds, of letters that are different because of how they relate to each other. And then other words that have similar sound combinations, especially at the end of a word, will then have been sort of bunched together grammatically with those. But the reason for the grammar differences, the different endings, for instance, in different cases, has nothing to do with biological gender. It has all to do with how it sounds. So it is a grouping based on what something sounds like. So if you think of it as noun categories, of course, you could categorize nouns then based on what they look like and what they sound like. But noun categories can be even more specific. You could have a noun category for animals, one for plants, one for human beings, one for long thing objects like a pen, for instance, one for books. And indeed, if you go and have a look at Japanese, they still have a noun category system based on a really wide range of categories. And that links together with how the Chinese characters work as well, because if you look at Chinese characters, they all have, and you see this even better in Japanese than in Chinese, by the way, because Chinese is more phonetic in the way it uses its characters. And when you see a Chinese character used in Japanese, it is there for the meaning and not for the sound. So each character, many of them look quite complex, but even the complex ones, you can pick out elements and see that, oh, that looks like a simpler character. That means person, for instance. And if you have the character for person inside a bigger character, that often means that that character has something to do with people. And the character person, which might take different shapes depending on whether it's at the top or the left or where it is in the character, is the character's root. The radical, as it's known as. So yeah, which means root. Radix is root in Latin. So, and which tells you something about the noun category that this character belongs to. So again, noun category. And when you do numbers in Japanese, you have the basic numbers, 1 to 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which you can say really quickly. But once you start counting things or people or animals or whatever, you have to add endings to the numbers, and they often change the pronunciation as well. So when you're counting people, you're saying hitori, one person, futari, two people, sannin, three people, etc. If you're counting long things, if I remember correctly, that is the ending hon, which gets changed depending on what comes before as well. So you have ippon, meaning one long thin thing, nihon, which means two long thin things, and sanbon, which means three long thin things. And of course, depending on context now, this way of doing it sometimes also means you don't have any need of pronouns because you're referring to something as a noun category, which is also what pronouns do, by the way that you talk about their number. So yeah, that's a noun category system. I hope that wasn't confusing. So yeah, so you have grammatical gender is basically the same as noun categories, and in Japan you have a myriad different ways of counting. So yeah. So grammatical gender or noun categories is something I wanted to have in Borvagefti, and of course once you add that in addition to a case system, you multiply the number of endings for your cases by the number of noun categories. And also you need plural as well. And sometimes some languages, in addition to plural and singular, they also have a dual, so a special ending for two things multiplied by noun categories. And also in plural, there might be different endings, whether the plural is two of this noun category, two of that noun category, or two of a mixed noun category. See where I'm going with this? It gets very complicated very quickly. So, too similar to Norwegian, very complex, no, not very complex, too many possible syllables, and very complex grammar. This doesn't sound like a beginner's Conlang project, and it really shouldn't be. So I decided to make something simpler. And my greeting today, that is in my simpler Conlang, known as so far as Latak, which is has a much simpler structure, a lot fewer sounds. The number of possible syllables, I think, are indeed just in the maybe around 50 or something like that instead of 10,000. So it's more similar sonic structure to Japanese, actually. But I have deliberately made sure that some of the sounds are different, so I don't actually associate it too much with Japanese, and I don't have to get distracted by Japanese at all when I use it. So so that is what I've been working on now, and there are, if you want to make your own Conlang, there are some online tools that can help you get started. And one of these, I'll just show you that now. I'll just move on to my screen. Yes, there is a website called VulgarLang, which can auto-generate new languages, and this is the one I used actually to start out. So you can choose which consonants and vowels to include, and then you can also choose which are going to be part of your syllable structure, if there's going to be vowel harmony, which combinations are not possible, probabilities of how your syllables are. You can add tones, just like in Chinese and Vietnamese, stress patterns, sound changes. So there's quite a complex features. You can define your spelling, of course, vocabulary, grammar, a lot of things. And I use this to create a sort of the bare bones of a new language. I'll just go down to save your language, load language, and just show you what came up here. So this is what came up. So the language of Latakian, not natively known as Latakia. So I just call it Latak actually because I prefer that. And then it gives me an example sentence, which I'm not sure if I actually agree with how the grammar has been done there, because I will need to change some things there. But it says here, Tama fota kekatsu mumu takubitsu oli oyu sakoye, which means, and he stood holding his hat and turned his wet face to the wind. And then we got the inventory here. So we got 5 vowels, E, U, E, O, and A. We have the consonants M, P, B, F, T, D, C, L, Sh, Y, K, G, and also W. One thing I do like about this is that it only has one nasal consonant. It doesn't have N, it doesn't have Ng. That allows me a little bit of leeway actually when it comes to sound changes, which I might want to do later. Spelling rules. Yeah, just how do you spell y, sh, and ts, I suppose, always important. And then we have, it gives us the standard word order, subject, verb, object, which is fine. Adjectives are positions before the nouns. That is quite common. And we have prepositions. Now, they're called when you have prepositions, we in English, when you think of them as prepositions, we always say prepositions as if that is something that is common to all languages, but the position word in languages are known as adpositions, and they can either be before or after. And when they come before, it is a preposition, and when they come after, it's a postposition. Nouns. So definite, there are no articles, or there are articles, but they are encoded in the endings of the words. For instance, here we have wetewa, the dog, and we have wetewotu, which is a dog, wetewogu, which is the dogs, and wetewoge, which is some dogs. We have the pronouns, first person singular, li, and then the second, u, ma, mo, ku, and ki. You can see these are sort of related in the way that they are constructed. There's a sort of coherence in them. Determiners, possessive determiners, we, wu, so, ti, si, ta. And we have verbs, present, past, and future. iko, ikoka, ikoto. Imperfective, so ongoing actions. I am learning and habitual actions. Iko. And for this is actually an automated one now, but I've been thinking of this is of course a starting point, I think, for adjusting it. So I may want to avoid getting this kind of thing where you have two of the same vowel in a row. So I have introduced what is known as a hiatus obstruction, and that's the letter H. So ihiko is how I would pronounce this. Ihiko. Numbers: kime, ka, midi, shu, la, mibema, wami, miko, mio, shi, takime, shubi, takime, kashubi, and wiyili. And then we have the derivational morphology, which is how you change one word into another. Adjective to adverb, add key, etc. Adjective to noun, very useful. And then VulgarLang gives you a dictionary of about, if you are a paying member, I think it's about 4,000 words. I think if you use the free version, you get about 1,000. And many of these are, of course, completely anachronistic to the world that I'm making, and so I will remove them, of course. But yeah, I'll have a look eventually. So abolo, wedi, pottery, abolomi, cauldron. Yeah, it makes sense. Abolo is bowl, pot, basin, and bucket. And of course, interestingly, abolo now, it looks a little bit like bowl. That is just a coincidence. So, and also many words that probably should be related are not necessarily related in this list. So I'll have to look through them and sort of see which ones I feel are not really the way they should be. But so I'm going to go through all the list, and I use this as a starting point. I'm probably going to remove a lot of words and add many new ones as well. Interesting thing about Latak is, of course, that, or Latake, is that the stress is always on the penultimate syllable, which is very nice because it means that when you add a grammatical ending, you also change the word stress, which I really like because it adds a certain poetry to it. So for instance, with the dog here, wetewo, the stress is on te, but if you have a dog, it's wetewotu. So the stress on the word stem is actually shifted, so which I quite like. So this is my starting point for my new Conlang, which is Latakia. I like calling it Latak anyway, but that might catch on. See, I'm deciding because I'm making the language myself, I suppose. So, so nobody else can tell me how it's done. So that is what I'm doing now. Instead of focusing on Borvagefti, which was too much work, I've dropped that for now. I'm going to do a much simpler language in Latake, which is what my greeting today came from. Shishi wi ime ohoko. I noticed also that the H is not really part of, when I'm transcribing my own name into Latak, it's actually oko. But the verb to be is o, and because I get two o's in a row, wi ime o oko, I'm choosing to put in the hiatus obstruction and make it wi ime o hoko, which it flows more easily. So in Latak, my name is actually Oko, but because of the hiatus obstruction, it sounds like it is Hoko. But yeah, it's actually Oko. So that is really what I was going to talk about today. So a little bit about why I didn't continue with my original Conlang and some of the pitfalls one can fall into, especially as a novice Conlanger, is to make it too complicated. So make it easy, make the phonology easy, make the grammar easy to start with, and then focus on making that one language work well before going on to more complex things, I think is the way to go. So I still think I should be adapting my writing system though to Latak, because I showed you a little bit before. We have the runic system I have here, and of course this was intended to be for the phonology of Worldbuilding, but there's no reason why I can't use the same letters for Latak. I think I'm going to use those anyway because I quite like them. I think they look really nice, and also the way I've made them, they can be written in any direction, left to right, right to left, top to bottom, and bottom to top, which I quite like because it gives it a kind of sacred symmetry, I suppose, that I can use for decoration as well. And it's the same thing with I know hieroglyphics. I know they can write them left to right and right to left and top to bottom. I'm not sure about bottom to top, but one of the advantages of having a writing system that is possible to do in different directions is, of course, when you do use writing as part of a kind of artwork, for instance. It gives you a lot of flexibility. You can make things symmetrical, perfectly symmetrical with writing as well. Right, was there anything else I wanted to tell you today? I think that is actually it. I think that is the main thing I wanted to talk about. So Conlang, my progress so far. I'm going to talk more about Latak in future episodes because I haven't really fleshed it out yet. I've just started making it. I created it was it last week? I think it was last week. Just the sort of the foundation of it on VulgarLang, and I'm going to work more on it, especially with the grammar, because as you noticed, it didn't have more than the grammar for verbs, for instance, doesn't say anything about aspect. So what happens if you want to express what happened in the past, for instance, like you said, if I had been going there yesterday, if I'd gone there yesterday, that means you are talking about if I had gone there yesterday, so conditional. It doesn't say anything about those sorts of things. It just past, present, and future, but that's just a really small part of what you express with verbs. So I need to establish exactly how do I express things like I should have done that, I will be going to, if I had been, etc. So all those things, I need to iron those out and find out what kind of constructions I want to use. And I don't want to make it too much like English in its use of modal auxiliaries necessarily. So I may come up with new verb endings. I may use a different kind of modal system. So yeah, I'm going to be looking into that. I'm going to go through the dictionary, the 4,000 word dictionary that VulgarLang gave me, and remove all the words that are not going to be part of my language. And I'm probably going to make a few new ones, and I'm going to also have to change quite a few words that I feel should be more related as derivations of each other that now have been given to completely separate words. So yes, work in progress still, and an interesting project, I think. So I hope you found this interesting and useful, especially if you are planning to write your own game book or make your own language. If you want to make your own language, there are lots of good videos online, by the way, amongst other things by, what's his name, David Peterson, I think it is, who did the languages for Game of Thrones. He has videos where he describes some of his process, and also some nice tips as well. I'll put a link in the description. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now. Bye bye.